rarely lose because you lack intelligence. You lose because someone moved your emotions first. Most people believe outcomes are decided by intelligence, or effort, or moral correctness. We like to think the world rewards those who think clearly, work hard, and act rationally. It is a comforting belief. It suggests fairness. It suggests control. But when you look closely at how outcomes actually unfold, a quieter pattern appears. A deal collapses not because the terms were wrong, but because irritation crept into the voice. A public figure unravels not because they lacked preparation, but because pressure cracked their composure at the wrong moment. A relationship fractures not over values or intentions, but over a single emotional reaction that could not be taken back. In each case, logic was present. Intelligence was present. Even good intentions were present. What failed was something more primitive: emotional regulation. We rarely like to admit this, because it challenges how we understand power. Power is often imagined as dominance, as assertiveness, as force. But the most consequential moments in life are rarely decided by who speaks the loudest or acts the fastest. They are decided by who stays internally stable while others lose their balance. Outcomes are shaped long before actions take place. They are shaped in the emotional state of the person acting, the tone they carry into the room, the tension they fail to notice, the subtle urgency that leaks into their words. These signals are read instantly, often unconsciously, by everyone else involved. And here is the unsettling part. Emotions are not just personal experiences. They are inputs. They can be influenced, provoked, redirected, sometimes deliberately by other people, sometimes by environments designed to keep you reactive, and sometimes by habits you mistake for personality. A calm individual in a chaotic situation holds an invisible advantage, not because they are smarter, but because they are harder to move. Their decisions are not rushed by fear. Their words are not distorted by anger. Their presence alone shifts the dynamic, often without a single overt display of authority. Meanwhile, someone emotionally compromised may believe they are acting freely, when in reality they are being guided, nudged, pressed, pulled toward predictable reactions that lead to predictable outcomes. This is not about suppressing emotion, and it is not about becoming cold or detached. It is about recognizing that emotions are the first battlefield, not the last. Because if emotions can be triggered on cue, rewarded when convenient, and punished when disruptive, then outcomes are rarely as spontaneous as they appear. Which raises a quiet question. If emotions can be influenced, redirected, or destabilized, then who is really in control of most outcomes? Long before psychology had language, experiments, or diagnostic terms, power already understood something essential. People do not move because they are convinced. They move because they feel. Reason has always been slow. Emotion is immediate. Ancient societies learned this early. Not through theory, but through consequence. A crowd could hear an argument and remain unmoved, but stir fear and it would scatter. Offer hope and it would follow. Trigger anger and it would destroy. Appeal to pride and it would sacrifice itself willingly. This was not accidental. Emotion was cultivated deliberately, carefully, repeatedly, not as a byproduct of leadership, but as its foundation. Before laws were written, rituals were performed. Before rules were debated, symbols were displayed. Banners, uniforms, chants, ceremonies, punishments staged in public. None of these were designed to explain. They were designed to impress, to overwhelm the senses, to bypass deliberation and produce a reaction before thought had time to intervene. Emotion became the original technology of control. It was cheaper than armies, faster than legislation, more reliable than persuasion. You could command behavior without commanding understanding. You could guide a population without ever convincing it that you were right. Fear kept order when logic could not. Hope sustained obedience when conditions were harsh. Anger could be redirected toward external enemies. Pride made people defend systems that quietly constrained them. What mattered was not whether the emotion was true, justified, or accurate. What mattered was that it worked. Crowds were not reasoned with. They were tuned. And those who understood this learned something else just as important. Emotional environments produce predictable behavior, heighten emotion, and people simplify. They polarize, they rush, they cling to symbols, they surrender nuance for certainty. In these environments, rational resistance weakens. The mind becomes reactive rather than reflective. Decisions feel urgent. Doubt feels dangerous. Stillness feels like betrayal. But not everyone reacts the same way. Those who could remain internally regulated in emotionally charged environments gained disproportionate influence, not because they were louder, but because they were steadier. While others were swept into motion, they could observe. While others reacted, they could choose. This imbalance quietly reshaped hierarchies. The emotionally reactive became tools. The emotionally disciplined became operators. Power did not belong to the strongest voice in the crowd. It belonged to the one who could stand inside the noise without becoming it. And this pattern repeated itself across cultures and eras. Different symbols, different rituals, different stories. The same mechanism underneath. Emotion bypasses resistance. It short-circuits analysis. It installs momentum. The battlefield, however, has shifted. The spectacle is no longer confined to public squares. The rituals are no longer seasonal. The symbols are no longer static. They refresh constantly. They travel instantly. They follow individuals into private spaces. But the mechanism has not changed. Emotion is still the fastest way to move people, still the easiest way to predict behavior, still the most efficient way to shape outcomes without appearing to control them. And just as before, those who cannot regulate their internal state remain vulnerable, not because they are weak, but because they are readable. The question now is not whether emotion is used as a tool of power. It is whether you recognize when it is being used on you. To understand why emotion so often decides outcomes, you have to let go of a comforting assumption. The human mind was not designed to be fair, balanced, or even truthful. It was designed to keep you alive. The brain is not a reasoning engine with emotions layered on top. It is a survival system that learned how to reason later, and survival does not wait for careful analysis. Long before language, long before logic, the nervous system learned to answer one question with speed. Is this safe or not? Emotion is the answer that arrives first. When a potential threat appears, the body reacts before the mind explains. Heart rate shifts, muscles tense, attention narrows. The system prepares for action without asking for permission. Fight, flight, freeze, appease. Different strategies, same purpose. Reduce uncertainty as fast as possible. These reactions feel personal. They feel intentional, but they are largely mechanical. Social rejection activates the same circuitry as physical danger. Uncertainty registers as risk. Loss of status feels like loss of safety. The body does not distinguish between a predator and a crowd turning against you. It responds with urgency either way. And here is where the illusion begins. Emotional reactions feel like choices, because consciousness arrives after the reaction has already started. The story comes later. The justification follows. The mind explains what the nervous system has already decided. This delay is subtle, almost invisible, but it is everything. Once emotion is activated, attention collapses. The field of awareness narrows to whatever confirms the feeling. Long-term consequences fade. Complexity feels unbearable. Certainty becomes comforting even when it is false. This is why emotionally charged situations feel so real, so immediate, so undeniable. The system is doing exactly what it evolved to do. Prioritize speed over accuracy. Logic, by contrast, is slow. It weighs options. It tolerates ambiguity. It delays action. In survival terms, this hesitation can be fatal. So the brain learned to let emotion lead and reason follow. Modern life exploits this ancient wiring constantly. Deadlines create urgency. Notifications simulate threat. Public opinion mimics social danger. Each trigger pulls attention out of reflection and into reaction. And because the reactions feel self-directed, they rarely feel imposed. This is what makes emotional influence so effective. You do not feel controlled. You feel convinced. Until awareness enters the process, reaction will always precede reflection. Not because you lack discipline, but because the system is working as designed. This is not yet a problem of self-control. It is a problem of invisibility, because once you understand that emotional reactions are predictable, a new and uncomfortable implication emerges. If reactions follow patterns, they can be triggered. And if they can be triggered, they can be used. Not through force, not through argument, but by pressing the right emotional buttons at the right moment. The outcome then feels spontaneous, but it rarely is. Power no longer needs a throne, a uniform, or even a face. It operates through systems, quiet ones, adaptive ones. Systems that do not tell you what to think, but learn how you feel and respond accordingly. Modern media, politics, social platforms, and markets are not conspiracies. They are feedback machines. They observe behavior, reward what spreads, and discard what does not. Over time, they become optimized for one thing above all else: emotional engagement. Outrage travels faster than clarity. Fear holds attention longer than understanding. Validation keeps people returning more reliably than truth. Calm does very little, nuance almost nothing. This is not because anyone decided it should be this way. It is because emotion moves people, and systems that depend on movement, clicks, votes, purchases, loyalty will always lean toward whatever accelerates behavior. Headlines are not written to inform, they are written to provoke. Algorithms do not prioritize accuracy. They prioritize reaction. Public narratives are framed not to resolve complexity, but to sharpen identity. Us versus them. Threat versus safety. Loss versus restoration. Emotion becomes currency. Anger keeps you engaged. Fear keeps you alert. Belonging keeps you loyal. Each response feeds the system with data. The system adjusts. It learns which emotional levers work best on which people, at which times, in which contexts. No malice is required, only measurement. And this is where the illusion deepens. Most people believe they are forming opinions, but what usually happens first is emotional priming. A feeling arrives before the thought. Disgust, anxiety, pride, resentment. The opinion then assembles itself around that feeling, giving it structure and justification. The system does not tell you what to believe. It nudges you into a state. From there, belief follows naturally. What you notice, what you ignore, what feels urgent, what feels threatening. These are not neutral perceptions. They are shaped by repeated emotional cues. Over time, this creates a quiet divide. Those who react emotionally become highly visible. Their engagement fuels the machine. Their outrage, loyalty, fear, and validation train the system to deliver more of the same. They feel involved, informed, activated. Those who remain emotionally neutral become increasingly invisible. They click less, share less, react less. The system does not punish them. It simply stops noticing them. This is not a moral judgment. It is a mechanical one. Systems amplify what feeds them, and so emotional intensity becomes mistaken for importance, loudness for truth, certainty for insight. Meanwhile, restraint is misread as apathy, silence as irrelevance, thoughtfulness as weakness. Yet beneath this dynamic lies a destabilizing realization. If systems can reliably shape emotional outcomes at scale, then influence no longer requires persuasion. It requires timing, framing, repetition, the right emotional cue at the right moment. And because the process feels internal, it rarely feels imposed. You do not feel manipulated. You feel justified. But this is only the wide-angle view. The same mechanisms that operate at scale operate even more powerfully in small, intimate spaces. Conversations, negotiations, relationships, power, dynamics between individuals. Emotional states leak. They are sensed instantly. Anxiety invites pressure. Anger invites escalation. Neediness invites withdrawal. Calm disrupts expectations. In one-on-one interactions, emotional control becomes even more consequential. There is no algorithm to blame, no system to point to, only two nervous systems influencing each other in real time. If large systems can shape outcomes by steering emotion, then individuals can do the same, often unconsciously, sometimes deliberately, which brings the focus closer. If emotion is the lever at every level of influence, then the most decisive question is no longer who has authority. It is who controls the emotional temperature of the room. Power becomes most visible when there is nowhere to hide. No audience, no system. Just two people in a room. In these moments, emotional control stops being an abstract idea and becomes leverage. Not the kind associated with manipulation or games, but the kind that quietly shapes outcomes without announcing itself. The person who reacts less sets the tempo. The person who stays grounded forces the other to move first. This is easiest to see in conflict. One voice rises, the other remains level. Instantly, the emotional weight shifts. The raised voice begins to explain itself, justify itself. The calm presence does nothing, and by doing nothing changes the balance. The same pattern appears in negotiation. Impatience leaks through small signals, a rushed sentence, a tightened jaw, a need to resolve the tension quickly. The other side senses it immediately. They slow down, they ask for more, they wait. In relationships, it appears as reassurance requested too early, answers pushed for too soon. Emotional urgency disguised as honesty. The moment one person reveals that they need a particular outcome, the dynamic tilts. None of this requires intention. Nervous systems communicate faster than language. Emotional states are sensed before words are processed. What often feels like confidence or dominance is simply emotional stability, the ability to remain present without needing to discharge tension immediately, the ability to tolerate uncertainty without rushing to close it. And this is where silence becomes misunderstood. Silence is not absence, it is pressure. When one person does not react, the emotional energy has nowhere to go. It stays in the room. The other person feels it and begins to fill the space. They talk more, reveal more, expose motivations they did not plan to share. This is not suppression. Suppressed emotion builds and leaks unpredictably through sarcasm, through passive aggression, through delayed explosions. Control is different. Controlled emotion is felt, acknowledged internally, and held without expression. It remains available, but it does not drive behavior. Most people lose leverage not because they are wrong, but because they react. They give away information too early. They escalate when stillness would have worked. They chase resolution when patience would have shifted the outcome. This loss often feels moral, like honesty, like transparency, like authenticity. But emotionally it signals instability, and instability invites influence. The uncomfortable truth is that emotional restraint changes how others treat you. Not because they fear you, but because they cannot read you as easily. Predictability disappears. Pressure has nothing to press against. This does not mean becoming distant or cold. It means allowing emotion to exist without letting it decide the next move. If you watch closely, you will begin to notice these moments everywhere. The instant a conversation changes direction because someone sighed. The way authority drains from a statement when frustration slips in. The way attention sharpens when someone does not rush to respond. Outcomes shift quietly in these spaces. Not through argument, not through dominance, but through presence. And once you see it, you cannot unsee how often the decisive moment was not what was said, but when emotion entered the room unchecked. The hardest part of emotional control is not the discipline. It is the silence it forces on the ego. Most emotional reactions are not attempts to solve a problem. They are attempts to be seen, to be understood, to be justified. Emotion wants witnesses, anger wants recognition, hurt wants confirmation, pride wants acknowledgement. Even sadness often wants permission to be legitimate. When emotion rises, the ego interprets expression as honesty, as authenticity, as self-respect. Holding it back feels like self-erasure, like losing ground, like letting something slide that should not be allowed. But look closer at what is actually being protected. In many moments, the reaction has little to do with the situation itself. It has to do with identity. A challenge feels like disrespect. Silence feels like dismissal. Disagreement feels like invalidation. The emotional response rushes in to defend a story about who you are. This is emotional leakage. Information about your insecurities, your expectations, your attachment to a particular outcome spills into the environment. Not through confession, but through tone. timing, urgency, the need to explain. And once that information is available, it can be used, even unintentionally. The ego resists this idea because it frames control as suppression, as denial, as weakness. But the deeper discomfort comes from something else. Emotional discipline deprives the ego of immediate relief. There is no discharge, no applause, no reassurance. The tension remains internal, unresolved, unshared. At first, this feels like loss. Loss of expression, loss of release, loss of being recognized in the moment. But this is the threshold. The moment emotion is contained rather than expressed, agency begins to return. You are no longer acting to reduce discomfort. You are choosing how and when to respond. This is not numbness. You still feel the emotion fully, sometimes more clearly than before, but it no longer dictates the next move. And this is where emotional control shifts meaning. It stops being about managing others. It stops being about winning exchanges. It becomes about alignment, about not allowing a passing state to speak for your identity. When you do not rush to defend yourself, you discover something unsettling. Most situations do not require it. Most threats dissolve when not fed. Most misunderstandings reveal themselves without intervention. The ego does not like this. It interprets restraint as defeat. But the body learns otherwise. Calm begins to feel less like suppression and more like coherence. The inner and outer worlds stop pulling against each other. Reaction gives way to choice. And in that space, something subtle changes. You are no longer leaking emotion to shape the environment. You are holding it to understand yourself. There is a reason emotional control matters most when the stakes are highest. It is not because pressure reveals character. It is because pressure removes filters. When emotional control fails, the cost is rarely immediate. It is structural. A single outburst reframes how someone is seen. A moment of panic rewrites competence as fragility. An emotional message sent too quickly becomes permanent evidence of instability. Careers do not usually collapse through incompetence. They collapse through exposure. The wrong reaction at the wrong moment, captured, remembered, repeated. Reputations are not undone by what people think in private, but by what they reveal in public when emotion overrides judgment. Trust drains quietly after that. Authority thins. Influence shrinks. Relationships follow the same pattern. One reaction said too sharply, one accusation made in fear, one boundary crossed in anger. The emotion passes. The memory does not. This is the asymmetry most people underestimate. Emotional reactions are temporary. Their consequences are not. Under pressure, the frame matters. The emotional frame determines how every action is interpreted. Lose it, and everything that follows is colored by instability. Explanations sound defensive. Corrections sound like excuses. Silence sounds like retreat. Emotional control does not guarantee success. Calm people fail all the time. But lack of control almost guarantees something else. Visibility. The moment you lose regulation, you become readable, predictable, reactable. Others know where to press, what to provoke, what to wait for. And often, no one needs to do anything at all. Most damage is self-inflicted. No conspiracy, no sabotage, no external enemy required. Just a nervous system pushed past its threshold and allowed to speak unchecked. This is not meant to produce fear. It is meant to produce precision, because the higher the stakes, the less room there is for emotional leakage. Not because perfection is required, but because the margin for repair narrows. Some moments do not allow for correction. Some impressions do not reset. Some reactions change the trajectory permanently. This is not unfair. It is simply how human judgment works. People remember how you made them feel when it mattered. They remember the moment you lost the frame. They remember the instability, not the context. And long after the emotion has faded, the outcome remains. Quiet, fixed, unmoved by explanation. Emotional control does not begin by fighting emotion. It begins by listening to it differently. Emotion is not an enemy. It is information. Every emotional signal carries data about perception, expectation, and perceived threat. Anxiety points to uncertainty. Anger signals a boundary that feels crossed. Sadness marks loss or attachment. None of these are problems on their own. They become problems when they are treated as commands. Most people feel something and move immediately. The feeling becomes the action. The signal becomes the decision. Reclaiming control starts with a small but decisive shift. Emotion is allowed to exist without being obeyed. This is quieter than suppression and slower than reaction. It is observation, feeling without performing, noticing the internal surge without exporting it into the world. In this space, something unfamiliar happens. The emotion begins to change on its own. Emotions are states, not truths. They rise, they peak, they pass. The nervous system resolves when it is not escalated through expression, justification, or rumination. This does not require technique. It requires tolerance. Tolerance for discomfort, for ambiguity, for the absence of immediate relief. Pausing is not avoidance. It is separation. A brief gap between stimulus and response where agency can re-enter. In that gap, emotion stops being a trigger and becomes a signal. You can ask what it is pointing to without letting it steer the outcome. This is where power dynamics reverse. When you do not act on emotion immediately, others lose access to your internal state. Pressure has nothing to press against. Provocation has no predictable effect. But more importantly, you regain alignment with yourself. A quieter relationship with the inner world begins to form. Emotion is acknowledged privately, not performed publicly. Decisions slow down. Reactions soften. Outcomes stabilize. This is not emotional detachment. It is emotional clarity. You are no longer trying to get rid of feelings or prove them. You are allowing them to inform without dictate. Over time, something subtle but decisive changes. You become less reactive, not because you are numb, but because you are present. Emotion becomes usable. Anger highlights boundaries without erupting. Fear signals risk without paralysis. Desire informs motivation without urgency. The internal world stops hijacking the external one. And in that shift, control returns. Not as force, not as dominance, but as choice. Emotion no longer decides the outcome. You do. Nothing dramatic changes after this realization. The world does not become quieter. Systems still provoke. People still test boundaries. Pressure still arrives on schedule. Emotions still rise exactly as they always have. What changes is subtler. The relationship to reaction shifts. You stop believing that every feeling deserves expression. You stop assuming that urgency requires movement. You stop confusing intensity with truth. And in that shift, something unexpected happens. Outcomes begin to organize themselves differently around you. Not because you are controlling anyone, but because you are no longer easily moved. Those who control emotions do not dominate conversations. They do not manipulate reactions. They do not engineer outcomes through force. They control access to themselves, access to their attention, their time, their responses, their emotional energy. This control is invisible, but it is felt. Others sense the absence of leverage, the lack of hooks, the unpredictability of someone who does not react on cue. In a world optimized for stimulation, this stability is rare, and rarity changes dynamics. Calm does not demand compliance, it creates gravity. People adjust around it. Conversations slow, tension redistributes, power rebalances without being named. This is why emotional control has always been misunderstood. It looks passive from the outside, unimpressive, even weak, but underneath it is precise. The individual who stays centered while others escalate quietly dictates the terms, not through dominance but through coherence, not by winning arguments but by refusing to be pulled into them. This is not about becoming untouchable. Emotions still arrive. Pressure still registers. The difference is that they stop dictating behavior. And because behavior remains consistent, outcomes stabilize. People trust what is stable. They follow what does not waver. They negotiate differently with those who do not leak urgency. Power does not announce itself. It does not need to. It settles. In a reactive world, stillness stands out. Not as absence, but as presence. Not as silence, but as containment. The moment you stop reacting is not the moment you gain control over others. It is the moment the world loses its grip on you, and that is where outcomes quietly begin to follow.